All right, well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces, some new faces. I'm Bev Atfield. I'm the Principal of Workplace Science at Jostle. We're a tech company based in Vancouver, British Columbia. And our product is an employee intranet, which helps connect people to things that matter to them at work. But my role at Jostle is really about reaching out and having conversations and trying to understand what's happening for people at work and what sort of experiences are people having at work. And that's why we have things like this Conversations at Work series and our podcast, People at Work, which lets us have engagement and conversation with leading thinkers and academics and people who are in organizations and workplaces really like working away at this issue of how do we engage and create these workplaces where people can really be fulfilled and flourish. So welcome to our session today. If you haven't been to one of these before, it's pretty easy. It's conversational. We try and make this as easy and comfortable as possible. I got some really wonderful feedback and thoughts when everybody registered around the things you were hoping to get out of today. What we're trying to achieve here is an open dialogue where we can share experiences, thoughts, ideas that can help all of us improve, and then go back into our workplaces or the places that we have contact with people and really share and further these ideas. So please feel free to participate in to the degree that you're comfortable. If you'd like to have your camera on, that's wonderful. If not, that's fine too. If everybody could be on mute, that would be great. And if you would like to contribute to something that we're talking about, just feel free to wave your hand, go off mute and jump in and add your thoughts. Or you can add something in the chat if you prefer. Jaden is here with me from Jostle as well, and she'll be helping us manage the chat. So feel free to use that as a place to share resources or ideas. I will keep an eye on it and we'll pull those thoughts in as we go along. You can also use the raise your hand feature in Zoom. So just feel free to participate in the way that makes you comfortable and feel included to the degree that you want to be. Okay, so that's the housekeeping. Our topic today is a bit of a curious one, but it's a really important one, and it's something that I don't think we talk about enough. And when we think about decency, maybe we default to things like, well, that's being nice to one another, or maybe it's having good manners, or it's just about being not being nasty to somebody. But really what it is it's about being a good human being who respects and includes others as equals and values their contribution. So I'm really excited to dig into this topic. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation because the words we use at work demonstrate the degree to which we're acting with decency. So I'd like to welcome our guests who are going to help me lead the conversation today. So Kelsy Trigg is joining us from SAP. She is the VP and Global Head of HR Advisors over there. I know Kelsy here in Vancouver. We are both trail runners and know each other in other pursuits other than our quest to make workplaces better. So welcome, Kelsy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you,
And
Beth.
then I'd love to introduce Rita Kakati-Shah, who is joining us from New York City. Rita is the founder and CEO of UMA, and she is a gender, diversity, and inclusion strategist. And Rita and I also know each other a little bit after we got to know each other through the podcast interview that we did together. So I'm really looking forward to furthering the thoughts and ideas that Rita had shared with me earlier about decency. So all that done, let's get right into it. So I'd like to ask Rita to kick us off. And Rita's been doing some really interesting work around something called the decency quotient. And that really got me thinking about how decency is one of the simplest ways that we can create inclusive workplaces and help leaders show up as more respectful, decent human beings. So I'm going to hand it over to Rita to give us a quick background of her interest and passion for decency. And then we'll hand it over to Kelsy to take it from there in terms of how decency creates inclusive leaders and places where people feel that they belong. So Rita, could I hand it over to you to get started?
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Beth, for having me. Hi, everyone. Greetings from a very rainy New York, I have to say. It's really a pleasure to be here. So how I actually fell into this work. So I am a workplace strategist, as Bev mentioned. And I noticed myself, I started my career in finance in London, where I was actually on the trading floor. And back in the early 2000s, when I started working, we were measured by our IQ, our intelligence quotient. That was one of the defining factors of how we were measured in the workforce. As you progress to leadership, that was something we were measured on as well. Fast forward a few years, then we were starting to get measured on EQ, our emotional quotient there, in terms of, what is our desire to help people, how kind we are to others, what is that emotional involvement as well. So then fast forward a few more years, and when I came to the US and took some time off to raise my family, and then started UMA, a company I helmed especially to empower women and minorities in the workforce, I thought, what is that missing factor that is driving from being an intelligent person to being emotionally aware to people leaving the workforce? Why is that even happening? And then I came up with, just looking around at, decency. Ultimately, all boils down to, are you a decent person? How are you as a leader? Now, what does that actually mean in terms of a measurement factor, for example? So if you think of measuring, if somebody has a high DQ, it's really that a leader is genuinely focusing their genuine desire in doing right by others. It's very simple, it's very concise, but that is basically what it is. Ultimately, when we look at the workplace and organization, there are three key elements really of how we measure ourselves by. And it's really honesty, kindness, and integrity. And ultimately, the DQ, as I love to call it, the decency quotient, is something that fulfills that. So that's really just a really, really brief overview. Happy to talk more about this a little later.
Rita, I love how you've brought DQ into my verbiage. I think it's in some ways, Bev, to your point, sort of common sense and something that we incorporate into all sorts of things. But until we had started this dialogue, I had thought more about IQ and EQ and some of the other more, I guess, traditional buzzwords. So I love the fact that your work has focused on bringing that in a slightly different dimension and back to that being a decent human being first and foremost. And for me, part of the thread, and those of you on the call who know me will know that the inclusive leadership piece is just near and dear to my heart. And so when I start the conversation around trust or inclusivity or the language that we use, for me, there's threads that really nicely weave in and overlap. And the other piece that I'll throw in up front, because I'd love to hear thoughts as we go along, is also a piece around gratitude and the language that we use. And an example that I have from recent is that at SAP, one of the things that we focus on is leadership trust. And there's a number of things that go into that, of course. And I know that we've got Daryl Stickle on the line here, who's an expert in trust, so he's going to keep me honest here. But we do a survey. So at SAP, we do a survey of our employees, and one of the questions is around leadership and leadership trust. And so recently we had the results. As a global team, we decided to send out a thank you, an appreciate award, really, which is just an email to the leaders that got the 100 score. So we did that I did that without thinking a whole lot about it. And my inbox exploded. It was unbelievable, the responses around, thank you for seeing me, thank you for noticing me. It's such an easy act to say thank you and that gratitude. But the one that kind of stabbed me in the heart just a little bit was I had one leader reach out and say, thanks for sending that. I didn't think HR even noticed. And I thought, wow, as leaders, when we have people who are doing such an amazing job and they feel like they're not even being acknowledged. So in addition to the decency thread there and the trust and how we can be inclusive, one of the things I've been pondering a lot lately is really around being more vocal in our gratitude, as long as it's coming from a place of being genuine. So lots of threads we can tie together here.
Yeah, thank you, Rita and Kelsey, for setting us off on a very interesting course here. And Kelsey, I love what you mentioned about being more vocal, because that really is what the essence of these conversations is about. What is the power of our voice at work? And our voices convey decency as much as our actions do. In fact, probably more so, because the way that we speak to people conveys whether we respect, whether we trust, whether we are creating an environment where people can be fully present in themselves and feel safe in those environments. So I'd like to probe, to start with, a bit about how does decency show up in language at work. So I think we've already established that language shapes and influences culture, because language shapes and influences humans, right? So perhaps we can start off with just probing a little bit about what does it look like when we're showing up in a decent way versus not being decent? Like what words are we using that actually convey decency? So Kelsy, maybe I'll ask you to give us your impressions of what that looks like for you.
Yeah, well, and I love language, and I'm privileged enough. I speak only English and a tiny little bit of French, and I know how to order beer and wine in German, and that's kind of the extent of my language abilities, got my priorities there. But you know, I love language because I really think that we don't understand a culture unless we can speak the language. So in international settings, that really can put a lot of us at a disadvantage, and the need to pay attention to the words that we're using. And so even though it's around language, for me, it comes back to how are people feeling, and are people feeling seen and heard, and in an environment where they can really bring the best. Because as leaders, with the language we use to create that inclusive environment, I come back to, are we giving people space to do what they can do the best? And so, yeah, paying attention to words, and as you say, Bev, you know, some of that's the language and some of that's the actions, and I think it's the combination there for sure.
Yeah, so Rita, thanks, Kelsy. Rita, just to pull on a couple of things that you were mentioning around, you know, the DQ really is made up of the honesty, the kindness, and the integrity.
Yeah.
How do those things get revealed or manifested in the words that we choose?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, actually to Kelsey's point, it's the words that we choose, it's the language that you use. And a step further, it's your body language as well. It's not always verbal language. It's those emotional cues that people get, your expression on your face. Are you pausing? Are you stopping to actually listen to somebody? But how are you listening? Are you looking them in the eye, or are you kind of on your phone typing away while they're talking to you? So it's things like that conveys how decent you are as a leader, a manager, or a colleague as well. And also to touch upon Kelsey's point, it's different across cultures as well, and across personalities. For example, I'm from the UK originally, and from London. And in London, I started off on the trading floor. You don't wait to be asked to speak. If you don't speak when you have an idea, your voice will not get heard. That is very different when I started off in equities to when I moved to a different division where, you know, you put your hand up and you wait to be called upon. So it really depends on the culture of the organization where you are too, and how you felt heard. Is either you get heard or you wait for somebody to acknowledge what you're saying. Just comment, just saying please, saying thank you, sort of looking someone eye to eye as well. But also going on from that, what if you are an introverted personality versus an extrovert? You may not feel comfortable getting your voice heard necessarily. You may not feel justified in giving your opinion, thinking, oh, I don't want to sort of, you know, dust the water, so to speak. So as a manager, as somebody who's a professional, you've got to try and make sure that everybody in the team can get their voice heard, even if they have nothing to say. That's totally fine. But say, Kelsy, do you have anything to add? Or Bev, do you have anything to say? I know you sent me an email about this just the other week, just to kind of help them out a little bit, to kind of put their foot forward. So they're very, very different ways of doing it, but these are ways of conveying that decency, that you genuinely care. You care for their feelings and what they have to say as well. Ultimately, people want to be heard and appreciated for what they do.
Rita, just building on that, I thinking back to a conversation I literally had just last night with one of my team members who's based in Asia, and we have really open and interesting conversations around both company culture differences and country culture differences. And one of the things we were talking about is that, and again, I do not like broad brush strokes. However, I'll use this example, is around the comfort with silence. And in different cultures, there's a very different sort of tolerance for silence. And in North America, generally speaking, we do a terrible job of actually letting there be some silence and letting there be room to read what that silence actually means. And I think that there's a finesse that can happen. And I've seen that with some of my colleagues in particular from Asia, who not only understand the silences better or differently, but that there is meaning that's coming with that. So on a personal learning, it's one of the areas that I'm working on, not just listening really carefully, but also listening with some discomfort in the silence sometimes. So yeah, language so important, and then that layering on of culture and the other pieces.
Absolutely. And just to add, it's those cues, you know, as a manager, leader, it's over time, over when you have experience, you start to pick up these cues, these emotional cues, these cultural cues as well. And they could be different as well. So absolutely.
Hi, Daryl, did you want to jump in with a thought?
Daryl, you're on mute.
Am I better now?
You're back.
Okay. So fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing. One of the struggles for me is this notion of subjectivity around the notion of decency. As we've talked through, there are going to be differences of opinion in different groups, in different settings, in different geographies. I suspect that if we were to ask certain people, they would say that Donald Trump is decent. And others would disagree strongly. And so I think part of what is essential for us is actually giving people the benefit of the doubt. And so I know that somebody that we were familiar with, she had a baby, and the baby was huge. And it looked like it came straight from Chernobyl Farms. It was so big. And people, Asian people would come up to him and say, "Oh, what a fat baby." And for them, that was a profound compliment, but it wasn't interpreted that way initially. And so that sort of benefit of the doubt, that sort of questioning, that tolerance or acceptance that somebody else may be trying to be decent and that we need to explore a little further.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Daryl. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it comes back to what is the climate that you're actually creating within your organization for where we give people the space and we give the benefit of the doubt? And is that a basic rule of engagement, if you will? So I don't know, does anyone else have an example perhaps from their workplace to, you know, continue on what Daryl was suggesting? Feel free just to unmute and jump in if you've got something to share.
I would love to.
Hi, Ashley.
Hi, good morning, Bev and everyone. Daryl, I love your point that you added just then because it makes me think of intent and effect. And often when if I've taken an exception to something someone has said and I've brought that up, I remember hearing, "Oh, but that wasn't offensive," in their defense of that comment. And it's because they didn't intend for it to be offensive, of course, but that's not how it landed. And so when you say, you know, being mindful of or giving the benefit of the doubt, assuming a positive intent, assuming decency in, you know, the sending of the message can be helpful. It's not easy though.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in there. They were really, really great comments. So in Indian culture as well, people have the habit of putting the foot in things according to the Western world. But the way it's seen in India, for example, you're not putting your foot in at all. You are being brutally honest, and that's how things are generally done. So, for example, what I've tried to do with some of the senior leaders in Indian companies that I try to coach, I say maybe lead with, for example, if you're complimenting a baby and in genuinely you are just, you know, you want to say something congratulatory, just say, in my culture, we're congratulating by giving you a compliment, which is your baby is a very good size or big, you know, so you can sort of preemptive that way. And then you can say, I hope that doesn't cause any offense. That's just how it's done in my culture. And I wanted to let you know. So that's almost by kind of taking a step back to saying, this is where it's coming from a good place. I'm really not trying to offend. This is just how a background it comes from. On the other side that you mentioned, Daryl, like for example, politics, it does get brought up sometimes. It's quite a topical environment. I'm in New York City. It's everywhere, you know, schools drop off everywhere. You can't avoid it. So how do you not sort of start throwing things at each other or having these sort of moments in front of your kids who are at the playground too? Well, I tell people all the time, regardless of whether it's at the dinner table, in the office or wherever it is, sort of take a step back and have time to just listen to the other person. You don't have to agree with what they're saying, but make sure they're heard. quite often what's going on now is difference of opinions with different things, and people feel they're just not being heard. So it's literally turns into a fist fight of who can get their word in and have the loudest voice. So it's almost like, okay, I respect your opinion. This is why I think what I think as well. And then sort of move on from that. Typically in the workplace is not the environment you want to discuss politics. So if you see it as a manager and you see things are getting heated, it's okay, I respect your opinions, but can we take this conversation elsewhere? And try to sort of turn away from that a little bit.
That's an interesting, sorry, carry on.
Just thinking about the seeing and being seen and being heard. And I listened to a podcast the other day, and I'll need to go back and share the name. It was a woman who did a couple of documentaries, and she was a Muslim woman who went and spent some time documenting jihad, and then also with some white supremacists, and talk about intensive environments. And the takeaway that I had from that was extreme listening, and not necessarily to agree or to disagree. And the essence there was with her extreme listening. I think her name is Dia. I will come back to that and figure out what her name was, because she was pretty extraordinary. And the extreme listening at some point started to diffuse and started to build relationship where you would think a relationship wasn't even possible, and where there were such divergent views and opinions and ideologies that it was really not an environment at all that could support that. So yeah, extreme listening is another component there.
Absolutely. And it shows mutual respect, by doing that as well. People want to feel respected. So
yeah, Rita, one of the things I wanted to just jump onto your prior thought was around decency does not equal agreement. Like, just you don't have to agree to be decent. Absolutely. I think is one of the points you're making. And I think as we cultivate our workplace cultures and as we grow as leaders, we are necessarily going to disagree with other people. But it's how are you personally showing up in that disagreement situation? You can still act with decency. And then what's the environment that you're building where people can have positive conflict and resolve problems and work together in a way that is still disagreement, but it happens in a very respectful and inclusive way. So maybe that can take us into our next area of exploration around when we're acting in a decent way, what is the result of being decent? So Kelsy and Rita, I know that you both have some interesting perspectives on some of the outcomes of showing up in a decent way. So Kelsy, maybe I'll ask you to start with some of your thoughts about when you're acting in a way that's inclusive and that creates a space of belonging for people. What are some of the things that start to be nurtured in that kind of environment?
Well, and thanks, Bev. In addition to sort of all of the ones that we would expect, part of what has been coming back to me lately is that we can all have so much more fun because we are able to show up as we are. And back to your thread around that human first and foremost. And I may even put Daryl on the spot in a couple minutes, because when I think about decency and how that continues to show up, a term that Daryl has used in his trust model is benevolence. And it's really looking at how do we demonstrate that we have each other's best interest at heart and we understand that. So when I see examples of how that shows up, we all tend to take ourselves so seriously these days. I mean, it's a serious environment, and the fun and the collaboration and the innovation, the risk taking, that's the other piece when we think about how do we create an environment where not only is there a level of safety, but there's an exploration component. So Daryl, I'm not sure if you want to throw anything in there around benevolence, because some of the work that Rita's been doing, I think, is the language and the essence is very similar to some of the research you've done.
Yeah, so when we start talking about benevolence, it's this belief that you have somebody else's best interest at heart. And one of the struggles that I find with leaders is often they'll say, well, I am benevolent. Or parents, I was working with a parenting group, And I asked them, I said, who here has their kid's best interest at heart? And all the hands go up, which is, they should, right? And then I say to them, how many of your kids would say that? And it's about a third. And so we have this misalignment where, because we haven't included other people in that conversation, because we haven't come to a shared understanding of what matters most for them, what their best interests really are, it doesn't land the way it should. And so, and I think benevolence, or that sort of belief that you've got my best interest at heart, is one of the most powerful tools right now when things are so uncertain. And so, you know, the example I give is, you know, I'm sitting having dinner with a friend, and one of you comes along and sees me about to eat dessert, and you say, oh, Daryl, you're really not going to eat that, are you? And you have my best interest at heart. It just doesn't land that way at that moment, right? Because this body doesn't just happen. It takes years of neglect. And so understanding or including someone in that conversation around what matters most to you and how do I help you get there is a way to really show benevolence and have it land.
I think just to add to that was actually really good, you know, commentary there. And I think just to kind of add to that, in the workplace situation, for example, I don't know, say somebody comes to, an employee comes to you and they're about to go on maternity leave, or they've just announced a life-changing moment in their life. In terms of having their best interests at heart, the company policy might be that, I don't know, New York City, for example, we really don't have much in terms of maternity leave here. It's 6 weeks and that's it. So the company policy might just said, okay, we're going to give you 6 weeks off. You're going to think, gosh, that is awful. We know they're going to need more than that. They've already got 3 kids at home, whatever's going on. Having their interests at heart, you might sort of recommend something else, or kind of go up above and beyond to help them get sort of help, caregiving, whatever else they may need, or introduce them to somebody else at the firm who's been on the leave or can act as some sort of like a mentor or buddy to them or something like that. So it's almost like taking a step further, saying, okay, what can I do to help that person get from here to there, to try and help them where they're going, if that makes sense. It's almost like they've provided you direction as their manager. As a leader, how can I help them? I'm trying to think in their shoes. If I were them, what would I be? So there's a lot of empathy involved in this as well. There's a lot of really taking that time to really listen. You know, for example, when it's the parent conversation as well, quite often you kind of think, well, I know better than my kids, but you're not actually listening. Are you listening to your kids? You know, that's the big thing there. Like, are you actually, or is it just one ear, you know, out the other? So it's a big exercise in really kind of taking to heart, actually taking the time to understand what is it that's going on, and whether or not you can add value that way as well.
Right. And being transparent around following up and saying, okay, so we had a conversation about what matters most to you.
Yeah.
And here, this is me taking actions to try to address that, to try to help you achieve what it is you want to achieve. Yeah. I've had the experience with my oldest son, who's now 19. When he was 12, he said to me, he said, Dad, even when you're giving me a hard time about something, I know it's about what's best for me. Mm-hmm. And that's, in that moment, you know, okay, we're doing all right.
Yeah.
And so you can have harder conversations about someone else's best interest, and it lands differently.
Yeah. Totally.
So that's an interesting idea that we could bring into the workplace too, around how do people leaders and team managers and supervisors actually project and demonstrate that they have other people's best interests at heart, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know, what are the thoughts around the group about how we can help our managers behave more decently, if we believe that decency consists of putting someone else's interests ahead of your own, perhaps?
May I?
Please, Ashley.
I think there's also a subjectivity that needs to be addressed as well when, you know, we're assuming that we share the common idea of what the best interest is. In Daryl's example of, oh, Daryl, you're not going to eat that cake, are you? I'm thinking, I bet that cake's really good. Yeah, you're darn right, I'm going to eat that cake, and might even have a second piece because it's so good. And that might give him such joy, and that would be in his best interest because maybe he had a tough day and he's enjoying that cake. And the colleague is thinking, oh, you know, thinking from their perspective, bringing what, their baggage, their ideas, their judgments, their experiences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and putting them on Daryl when maybe that's not appropriate or suitable or desired or not considered helpful in that example. So I think some language upstream and agreement upstream on what the outcomes, the shared outcomes are, what are the best interests, and do we both agree on exactly what those best interests are? That might be helpful in having those conversations at work and saying, this is a decision that I've made, or this is a thought that I've got, an idea that I'd like to share with you, because I think it aligns with what we've agreed is what you want and what we want, and that what works for both of us.
Thanks, Ashley. Carry on, Kelsey.
Thanks. Yeah, the other word that I'll bring into the conversation, because I think a lot of these are tied together, whether it's decency or benevolence or trust, is also consistency. And some of what we're talking about takes time. And so as leaders and in terms of demonstrating decency, some of that doesn't just happen because you show up and you say, oh, I'm a decent person. I'm going to do X or Y. For me, a lot of that, it's a long-term relationship building. It's consistency. It's doing what we say we're going to do. And years ago, I had somebody use the term consistent, and I thought, oh, it's such a boring word. And it's become one of those words that I love now, because it may not be exciting, but it is fundamental for how we show up and behave day over day, in the good times, in the bad times, when we've got a pandemic going on, when we're adjusting our own expectations. So I guess the other thread that I pull into this one is around consistency over time and what we can do with that.
Yeah, on the back of that, actually, I like to think of consistency as almost like you're building up a muscle. You're building muscle memory. When you're trying to do something, a new concept for the first time, you don't just get it. You don't just walk before you can crawl. You can't just ride a bike. You have to keep practicing. It's the same with decency. It's the same with this practicing to listen. Some people are just not good listeners, so it's almost like you practice this day in, day out, and then it slowly starts becoming part of how you kind of show yourself at work as well. And then I would add to that as well, not just being consistent and sort of exercising this every day, but sort of accountability as well. Sort of almost bringing up, whether it's almost part of a year-end review or a conversation later on, to kind of say, well, how have you been decent? Let's analyze, give us an example of what you might have done and talk about that. Because that way, to Ashley's point, the perspectives can be brought up as well. Well, actually, they saw it this way and I saw it this way. But if you as a manager can say, well, actually, there were a couple of different viewpoints where so-and-so saw it this way, the other member of the team saw it this way. But as a manager, I thought, I had to balance it out, had to be neutral, but in the best interest of the team, this is finally what I decided to do. So it's almost like you're being accountable, but you're trying to show that you're not taking steps, and you genuinely are trying to think of the best interest as well.
Yeah, I like that, Rita, because you're tying in. I've just seen a comment in the chat there from Darren around, isn't there a conflict when we're responsible for having the organization or the team's best interest? And you've touched on some of that. I think it's also an interesting question around how are we measuring performance, and what are our key indicators that deem success? And I don't actually think that there's a conflict there. I do think that there can be different ways to the same outcome. I also think that there's an opportunity to jointly define what success looks like with the team, so that there isn't that potential tension or that natural tension. And then where there are differences or disagreements, then they're much more straightforward conversations than the potential inconsistency of, well, hang on a minute, how am I being measured, or what does that look like, and why am I being penalized for X? Yeah, so threading that back to that, Rita, thanks.
I like the use of consistency, Kelsey, because it reduces uncertainty. And for me, trust is about uncertainty and vulnerability. People ask themselves, how likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty, and if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability. And one of the things about decency or benevolence or all of these traits we're talking about, or integrity, is it allows people to predict how we're going to respond. And it makes them more comfortable actually having conversation and dialogue with us. And they make themselves vulnerable when they do that. And you're experiencing that in New York now, where, you know, people having disagreements can become fairly intense, whether it's about wearing a mask or who they're going to vote for, or how they're responding to different news cycles. All of these things are potential vulnerabilities when we start to express them. And if we want, you know, part of what Bev's goal is to drive conversation and dialogue. Well, we need people to actually trust one another enough to express themselves honestly, and to find ways to disagree without becoming entrenched.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, sorry, Bev.
No, go ahead.
Just on the back of that, actually, Dan, really, really good point. So, for example, in New York, when the whole George Floyd incident happened, some of the, managers were quite sort of, uncertain. They were like, okay, we want to do something about this. How do I do it? What do I do? So, we started to have just conversations with managers and say to them, you know what, just pull your team into a room, whether it's a small team meeting, depend, your level of seniority, and say to them, like, obviously this is happening. How do you feel? And you talk about your own feelings too, that, I was quite shocked by this, or this is how it made me feel, or I'm a white male. I've never, witnessed or experienced some of those things. So, but I'm shocked to see this, whatever it is. But I would love to know how you're feeling too, because here specifically, where we do have a very cosmopolitan infrastructure with people from different backgrounds from all parts of the world, it did hit people very hardly. So having that conversation makes it almost open that, oh yes, I can voice my opinion. Somebody cares about how I feel. It doesn't have to be a company policy. Companies quite strict about not showing a view one way or the other. But as a manager, you can be decent that way and say, look, how are you feeling about this? Does anyone want to talk about it? And provide that sort of platform for people to voice their opinions and feel heard as well. And then about the mask thing, because we have people, it's very, very much like, I refuse to wear a mask, or I'm going to do it. And people, again, political, whatever it is. So the way I try to tell people is that, think of, you're going to somebody's house. When you go into somebody else's house, you tend to respect the rules they have. For example, I come from an Indian background. We don't wear shoes inside the house. So when we have guests come over, we ask them, I said, would you mind moving your shoes? And nobody has ever said no and then left. They always sort of respect that, regardless, similarly, if we go to somebody else's house and they don't have that policy, we respect their policy. It's the same thing. When you're in somebody else's store or shop, whatever, what are their rules? If their rules wear a mask, you put the mask on. If you want to go shop somewhere else, you can absolutely do that. But it's the same as respecting where you are. It's common respect. If somebody has a different viewpoint, you hear them out. You respect what they have to say. You don't have to agree with it, but you respect it. It's the same kind of thread.
Yeah, and I think, Rita, that comes back to what are the ground rules for how we operate together within an organization, and what does that say about our culture? And necessarily there's some intentionality there, right? We're being purposeful, deliberate in what we're saying is, this is how we will show up in our organization. And that necessarily has to tie into our values that we set as an organization. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how are organizations actually shifting their belief systems really to be more inclusive and to allow us to create these more high trust environments that are grounded in the operating procedures for the organization. So I don't know, does anyone have an example of a shift that they have made either as a leadership team or in the cultural framework of the organization that is allowing for us to have more of an expanded view around inclusiveness and respect and trust, as we've discussed over the last few minutes?
One of the things that I've noticed lately is that the whole conversation around organizational culture has become, it seems, and maybe it's just my perspective, more mainstream. It used to be a little bit more out there, and what do you mean about organizational culture, and what does that, how do you define that, and what does that look like? And one of the things that I've observed at SAP in particular is that there are what we call how we run behaviors, which is really the values and foundational language. And that was rolled out, I believe it was in around 2015. So it's not something new. We're extending that also now around how we lead. So not just how we run, but how we lead. And for me, there's something really concrete about having language that 100,000 people know, that there is buy-in or at least acknowledgement of a values statement, a conversation, however people want to frame that. So, rightly or wrongly, excuse me, I think the work that organizations are doing to be really concrete about the language that, it's not just another poster up on the wall. It's something that hopefully people are living and breathing and enacting every day. So I think the whole conversation around organizational culture is an important one, and I see that shifting. I see it becoming much more practical versus this esoteric conversation from a number of years back.
Yeah, I would say I 100% agree with what Kelsy has said, but also, traditionally we used to see workplace culture as coming down from top down. It would be the senior leadership, they would define it. However, in these days, as we get into more multinational organizations and whatnot, the culture is actually developed grassroots upwards. So that's the other thing. You have sometimes conflicting cultures now. We have a senior leadership culture, then you have the ground culture, which is very much can be different as well. So I think as a middle manager, as sort of a leader out there, it might sort of pay well to actually be down there with your folks, with your teams, and actually see what is the messaging, what is going on down below, to think maybe we should sort of change a little bit of our viewpoints or our hiring policies, or sort of maybe have some sort of groups or cultural days, affinity groups, whatever you want to call them, to help and grow the different cultures that we're seeing now as well.
Rita, just building on that, I see that Ashley's put a question in the chat about how did you diffuse the desired language in your org. So what was interesting is to your point, Rita, around that grassroots. Ashley, part of what happened, and it was a huge initiative, was that the guidance came from top down, but the development of those how we run values was bottom up. And there were an enormous number of people that were involved. I mean, to the point that at the time, quite openly, I thought, wow, like how many more people can get involved in conversations like this? But what it did, it was an excellent example of really having people feel heard and contributing to that conversation. So it was very much grassroots. There were working groups. It was done all over the world. It was facilitated by employees, not necessarily even an HR program. So again, it wasn't seen as another corporate thing. It was really seen as how do we, using your language, distill into our core values and language that we get behind. And what's really interesting is that in day-to-day now, we will hear team members use language sort of without even realizing. One of the core values is tell it like it is. And you'll hear people use that in the language that we use in a day-to-day basis, just sort of threading back to the values, building bridges, not silos, embracing diversity, so that, there's no rocket science in any of it. But what I think has been super successful is that it was done on a very broad, very widespread, to Rita's point, grassroots level. And and it's to be holding. Thank you.
Kelsy, I love that you've stepped us down into the practical realm of what does this actually look like? What are the actions we need to take, right? Because I think a lot of the time it's all fair and well to say, well, let's just be decent to one another. What does that actually look like? And it's quite complicated because it's different from one organization to the next, just as the rituals are different from one family to the next, as Rita was alluding to. So I'd like to step into that very practical arena, if we can, for the last bit of time that we've got together. And we had initially thought that we'd break into a breakout room here, but I think that there's probably enough of us just to stay here and stay focused. Or if the group feels like we should break into smaller groups, if that would facilitate more intimate conversation, I'm happy to do that too. So Kelsy and Rita, I'm going to put the decision out to you. What would you like to do?
I'm happy with either, but I think if it's intimate enough as it is, we can maybe stay on. So
I like staying where we're at unless anybody feels the strong urge.
Okay, if there's anyone who feels strongly in the group about going into your own breakout room, please put up your hand now and we'll debate it. Yeah, I think we've got a really great energy going here. I love the conversation flow that we've got, so let's keep it going. So let's talk about some practical things that are happening within people's organizations around how are leaders showing up and really walking the talk and putting into practice some things that demonstrate decency or that help engender trust and respect. And Jared had a comment earlier on in the chat around creating a wiki for different cultures. And thanks for the shout out to Jostle and maybe using an intranet as a way to build that kind of place where people can go to find resources and information and sharing of experiences perhaps. So I don't know, Jared, did you want to elaborate on that idea and maybe something you've seen in practice? Don't feel any pressure, you don't have to jump on.
Learn about other cultures. I've used YouTube or other streaming services just to pop in to see how other people, or just other Zoom meetings, just to see how other people are doing things. And so maybe just like Grain can record things, but you can also just do a wiki. You could just, you know, these are the, I work at companies where they tell you, you know, this is how we do things here. It's just nice to know some kind of game plan. That way there's no misunderstandings from the get-go.
Yeah, completely agree. Anyone want to build on that? Hi, Andy, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to build on that. Jared, you're right. There's all sorts of tools out there. You can just go to like a Lonely Planet and find out what it's like to live in a different culture, or you know, shout out to an organization called GlobeSmart that we used to use at SAP a long time ago. I've done a lot of traveling in my time, and I always like to try to learn a couple of words in the language of where I'm going, at least enough. Shout out to Kelsey to order wine and beer in that.
Priorities. Priorities.
Survival skills.
I often say I know enough, you know, of the language to get myself in trouble, not enough to get out of it. But you know, I think that's important. If you're going to be, you know, working on a global team, show that you're vulnerable and go out of your way a little bit and try to learn a couple of words in a different language. The other thing is, you know, I've done a lot of work recently with some founders, some entrepreneurs who are obviously extroverts, but teaching them and coaching them that not everybody is an extrovert, and that they're going to end up with a fair amount of introverts on their team. And you know, I've got a founder that I'm working with now. He's got a customer service team of 40 people. And he always used to have a team meeting of 40 people and you know, leave a half hour for open discussion. And when we got to that point, you could hear crickets. And it would drive him nuts. I go, well, there's a lot of introverts there. Have you ever thought of maybe holding 4 10 people sessions, or you know, 8 5 people sessions? And he started doing that, and he, you know, he started to learn that his people had some ideas. So it's respecting that and being decent about people's styles.
Yeah, and there's an extension of that is being open to different ways of doing things, and that there isn't just one way to be decent, right? So understanding what those other options are and maybe reading the room to understand what decency looks like for people who are in the space that you're in. Any other...
Oh, just wanted to share an example. Yeah. So we actually helped a company put together a new joiners program for kind of new folks joining after kind of like, you know, a couple of years of work experience. So they weren't straight out of university. So they came on and we asked them to kind of put together like a video montage. So each of them shared, and there was like, you know, a couple of set questions they had was like kind of like almost like a day in the life. It was meant to be like a fun thing to do. So it's almost like, you know, to trying to bring out their cultural background, something about, you know, where they were born and brought up, something that is a value that's strong to them. So like, you know, what does an evening look like for you? What does mealtime look like for you? And it's different with somebody who has kids versus somebody who is a part-time, you know, Japanese sushi chef as well. We didn't know that until we saw the montage come out. So things like that was actually a fun way of opening up conversations about cultures, because then everyone got to discuss it after they showed on opening sort of the first day. And if that's how they introduced everyone to each other, that was a very good moment of getting everyone to, and that was a conversation starter too. So just little things like that, companies can think about as well.
I'm going to be remiss if, Andy, I don't put you on the spot here. I know you're going to wonder where I'm going, but one of the things that Andy has done for years, which is just brilliant, is his one pager of how to work with Andy. Do you want to tee that up, Andy, and share the?
Wow, you remember that.
Not only do I remember that, I still use you as my example of brilliance in how to set the scene. So yeah, turning it over to you.
So yeah, okay. So it is a one pager, and I had done a lot of work as a project manager, and in SAP you're pulling together people from all over the world, and some may have known me, some didn't know me, and so I would simply send out this what it's like to work with Andy, and it was, Andy does not like email exchanges that go back and forth, and nobody's making a decision, and people get added to it. I said, I have low tolerance for that. I'll make a decision. And I did try to tie some of it to how we run at SAP. But I'll send that out now to a prospective client in my consulting business. But Kelsey knows I enjoy having some fun with this stuff, so it's not just
love that.
And it's so practical, and part of what I noticed is that it would open up conversations. Not only was Andy setting that example, he was giving really practical tips on how to, shortcut in working well with him. And it also gave people permission to share what worked for them. And so, it set that leadership precedent of saying, okay, how to work with Andy. Here's a one pager, take it or leave it. But I use that to this, and that was many years ago. I use that to this day as an example of a nice way of building that trust and rapport.
Simple things like if you like setting the groundwork. If you CC me on an email, I'm going to assume that you're not expecting a decision from me. There's no action for me. I will read it. I will file it. If you want me to do something, you're going to put me up at the tippy.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems to work. Feel free to share it with the group, Kelsey, if you still got it.
Bev, can't hear you.
Bev, you're on mute.
Still can't hear.
How about now?
Perfect.
Back.
Thought I could get through one Zoom call without a technical hitch. And ironically, I was talking about how clear communication is really what sits beneath everything we've been talking about today. And if you can't get your communication heard, then it's as good as not talking at all, right? So, so some really interesting points being raised today. As we're coming to the top of the hour here, is there anything else that anyone would like to throw in as a practical insight or idea or something for others to take away? I really appreciate everything that's been shared so far. Go for it, Angie.
All right, thanks, Bev. I teach organizational behavior at University Canada West, and our students come from all over the world. And so what I like to do, since we're learning online and they don't have the opportunity to connect and network and bond, I invite them in an introduction discussion forum. I give them 10 questions that they are asked to answer, including what's your favorite food? What do you do when you're not studying? And so getting to the personal sphere, I think, is also a really beautiful way to allow people to see the similarities that they have with people that come from all different countries, all different cultures. And also personality style, introvert, extrovert, how do you like to communicate? How do you, and bridging that gap between, the professional sphere and your personal life, I think is a really great and powerful way to build rapport and build trust among people so that you do give them the benefit of the doubt and you do assume benevolence and decency in their intent.
Thanks, Ashley. That brings us to a really good place to end this conversation around being decent isn't necessarily a very human behavior. It's a human way of being. So as far as we can bring it down to the human engagement,
the easier it is for us to be decent. Because if we see someone as a human just like us, we start to relate to them and feel that we have a kinship with them, and probably act in a more decent way than if we just see them as a number or a block of people that we don't have any emotional connection to. So thank you for that. So I'm going to ask Kelsy and Rita if you'd like to end us off with just a quick 30 seconds close of any parting thoughts you have for us, and then we'll wrap up here before 11 o'clock.
Excellent. Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much again for having this forum. I've learned a lot from it too. I think it's really, really meaningful. But, just to end off, I think, ultimately to be a decent management, to exercise that decency quotient, you've got to think of the other person's interests at heart. So how do you do that? Having respect, having the time to listen to them, and showing empathy. And that should set you in a nice stead forward.
Yeah, that's lovely. There's really not much more that I'll add to that. Decency, trust, kindness. We're all human beings. Yeah. Thank you, Bev.
Thank you very much. So that wraps us up for another session. I've really appreciated the insights here and just the humility and the humanness of this conversation. So thank you to everybody who shared and participated and who gave up an hour of their day to contribute to the conversation. Our next conversation is happening on November 12th, and it's going to be on meetings that you actually want to be part of. So I think we can all agree that the last 8 to 10 months have been pretty hard having all these engagements online, but we'll have some friends who will be talking about how to create engaging meeting spaces, especially in an online format. So please do join us and take the ideas we've shared here forward, and thank you very much, and have a wonderful day wherever you are. Take care and be safe, and wear a mask.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Bye.
Have a great day.